Chapter 5, Introduction to Macroeconomics. Okay, the little description here is not very good at all because uh, we're going to talk about a lot more than how the economy is measured, though that is pretty central. But as far as why recessions periodically occur over time, his explanations are very brief, at least in one instance wrong, and this incomplete, and smoothing over what is a very controversial topic. What causes recessions? Um, Big source of debate in economics. It's more going to be about how the economy is measured and some of the sources used to predict what's going to happen to the economy, and mostly that. Okay, learning objectives. 5.1 is going to be pretty straightforward. 5.2. Yeah, this is not a good description at all. He's actually a little confused, our friend Xiang, here about this. There is basically one method he's going to talk about that measures the business cycle, and there are three that are ways to predict the business cycle, which is not the same as measuring it. One's a report, one's not. Okay, this NIPA thing, that's, the acronym for the National Income and Product Accounts. That is a methodology. Okay, that's an accounting methodology for the United States. It has more than several components. We're going to talk really just almost exclusively. We're going to make some reference to another one, but it's mostly going to be GDP. That's the primary methodology for measuring the accounts in the United States. And we're going to find out that this GDP, there are two different ways to measure GDP that will come to the same thing. Okay, and those two ways are, I'm going to do this backwards. It makes a lot more sense to present it that way based on the example he starts with later. But right now, there's going to be the income approach to measuring GDP, and it's going to be made up of several categories, and an expenditure approach. And we are going to simplify one, if not both of these, a little bit. He's talking about the technical measures that the government uses. That's fine. I actually don't care if you know that or not at this point. I'm going to get more general and simple. Okay, so, yeah, at least in income, I'm going to just divide it into 4 categories as well, or actually 5. But, oh, wait, sorry, 4. 4 for income. And that will give us 4 for GDP. Okay, yeah, okay, GDP as a measure of a country's standard of living. That's a famous, there's a very famous example of its failure that no macroeconomics class is complete without, that we'll get to. Yeah, okay, non-market. I'm probably going to just let you read that. I have too much I really want to say about that at this time. Okay, so yeah, pandemic. Actually, this is, I believe, far more interesting, relevant to chapter 10 if we go back to government fiscal policy, because it was very unusual in American history to conduct fiscal policy by directly giving money to consumer workers, um, consumers. It is a far better way to simulate aggregate demand. They usually give it to, very top heavy to banks, basically. But if you want to get an economy going, this is a way to do it. One of the things that was what I've seen so far was one of the problems that you had a little more trouble with was transfer payments. Now I realize that Chiang talks about discretionary and mandatory spending. I'm not as interested in that difference. It's too specific to the United States, I think. I just want to be more general. But remember, it's very important to understand something. Rich people, these are not statistics to be, quoted. But let's say you give them $100, they're going to put 90 of that off an investment somewhere. Now, it's not that that doesn't create some investment demand, but a lot of it goes off into these, watch the movie The Big Short, these financial games, goes off to Vegas or something. It's just money. It doesn't get used to spend anything. Only 10% get used to spend. However, workers and consumers, it's like it flips. It's like 90% of their paycheck is going to go for spending. So if you want to stimulate consumer demand, you have consumers buy more stuff, and companies are like, "Oh, wow, our profits are going up. Um, let's make more. Let's hire more workers." Okay, that's how it works. There are exceptions to that. The 70s made it a little bit different. There may have indeed been some more supply side issues, but this is really the way to do it. And next chapter, we're going to talk a little about inflation. We'll probably bring that up as far as the COVID checks there. But this is actually really relevant to chapter 10. What the thing you guys missed was the transfer payment things. Now, it's not that the COVID checks were a transfer payment; they were deficit spending. But transfer payments work by the same principle. The wealthy, you know, you give money to banks or you give money to the wealthy. As I said, 90% is going off into monetary never land, or a big good portion of it. Whereas if you give that same money from the rich to the poor, they're going to spend more. The poor are going to spend more. Okay, that's the importance of sort of transfer payments, and it's also the case with these COVID checks. But that's chapter 10 stuff. But keep it in mind because there is a final exam and things that, and so just keep that in mind. So yeah, I'm not going to do anything with this. Okay. Yeah, data literacy. You guys can check that out if you want. Um, La di da. Okay, so business cycles. Super easy stuff here. Don't let this is one of the things in economics. Yes, it really is this simple. Okay, got some nice vocabulary words to remember here. Now, the thing I really want you to get, well, there's two things I really want to get to you to get about this. Number one, um, I would kind of think about these as like a cycle of nature. Okay, uh, there was actually a fellow named Kondratiev. He came up with Kondratiev waves, and he's trying to kind of map, these waves of a business cycle, almost like they're laws of physics or something. I don't think per se that there's any accuracy per se to that, but it's kind of important to think of them as just sort of almost like a law of nature. Sun rising, sunset, winter, spring, summer, and autumn. There's these cycles. That's number one. Number two, the roller coaster analogy that Chiang uses is bad. When you get on a roller coaster, you get off at the same place you got on. It's not like that with the business cycle. You see this trend line; it's upwards sloping. I'd like for you to think of that as this as a snake winding up a pole. Okay, because it's always other things equal, right? Economies are always growing, especially major developed ones like the United States, and part of that growth process is ups and downs, but always growing. Um, so peaks are when we're at the top, when everything's kind of hit its, you know, that we've production is relative to the other points on the business cycle at its best. Then there's a recession as it falls down. Trough is at the bottom. Easy word. Pigs trough. Peak. We all know mountain peak. We've all heard the term recession. Right here, recovery. I don't like that word. It's expansion. That's a more widely used term. and I like it more because we're kind of expanding and growing. We're not just getting out of recession. Number one, and number two, the United States has been very kind of lucky, if you will, over the past 50 or 60 years, in that we've had really long periods of expansion, like 10 years and so forth. So it doesn't really feel like we're just recovering from the last recession for those 10 years. We're expanding out. I mean, a recession is like unusual these days. It's, over these years, these past decades, over these past decades, it's like really big news if there's a recession. But it's not. It doesn't feel as much like a business cycle. It still is. Another thing about this that's kind of interesting that is in the news a couple of years ago. Um, I had always learned that a recession is like 2 quarters. We know what a quarter is. It's a fourth of a year. Okay, so January, February, March is a quarter. April, May, June is a quarter. July, August, September is a quarter. Okay, so if we've gotten 2 quarters and we're going down in this recession, we're going downhill for 2 quarters, then it's called a recession. Um, However, a couple years back, there's a controversy because we had a loss of growth for 2 years, but the Biden administration was claiming there was not a recession, and it turns out there's different ways of defining it. And usually, people kind of associate a lack of economic growth or declining economic growth with falling employment. But at that time, there was not this fall in employment to match the recession, so it didn't really feel like a recession. And the NEBR, uh, excuse me, NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, did not actually call it as a recession. Um, so what a recession actually means is a bit subjective. Okay. Okay, here's a word we brought up last time: capacity. Okay, peak a business cycle. In theory, at least, we're at capacity. All resources are being fully used. When we're not at capacity, they are not being. Kind of covered that in chapter 10. Yeah, right. Recessions can also be called contractions. Um, okay, tables. Yeah, you guys look that over. Okay, yeah, not a roller coaster. Okay, a snake winding up a pole. Double dip recessions. Okay, I'll let you read that. Okay, dating business cycles. This is kind of interesting, actually. Um, I feel like he drops a ball here a little bit. He's kind of missing like the main point. Our friend Chiang. Um, Actually, he's a really nice guy. He wrote me an email and invited me. We went back and forth. He invited me to hang out with him in Las Vegas, actually, um, where he teaches at UNLV there. So him and a bunch of friends and stuff. He kind of does that on a regular basis. So he assured me it'd be fun. I'm actually headed out to NorCal. I was trying to think there was a way to stop by us, Las Vegas, on the way. I don't think my flight stops off there. Unfortunately, I'm not taking Spirit Airlines this one time because they always have a layover in Las Vegas. It would have been perfect. Um, okay, so I'm not so super interested in this. Yeah, dating business cycles. How long they lasted. The thing I want you to get about this MBR thing here, okay, is that this is a report. Okay, that word, report. It is talking about what has already happened in the past, and it is reporting on it. So, this is kind of like a technical thing, like an accounting thing. They're kind of like telling you when the last peak was, recession, trough, expansion, um, and next peak. So, when has that happened? So, that's the takeaway from this dating the business cycles. Now, we talked about alternate measures of the business cycle. Okay, maybe that's their official name, but that's not what's of interest. Yeah. So this is it. He does say it here. MBR focuses after they occur. But everyone wants to, did you ever see Back to the Future 2? Oh, I don't want to give a spoiler there, but people want to know what happens before it occurs, right? That's where the money is, and what happens before it happens. So these next three are not just alternate measures, they are predictors. These are three attempts to predict if there is going to be usually a recession. They usually only predict recessions. They're not they're not actually talking here. They're not about predicting the recession's ending or expansions. I'm not saying they don't do that, but that's not covered here. Okay, Chicago Fed. So the Chicago Fed is the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. I think there are 12 Federal Reserve banks. We are not going to be actually getting to too much talking about Federal Reserve banks this term, but obviously there's two in Missouri, one in St. Louis, one in Kansas City, and they give tours if you're interested. Uh, you can get like shredded currency and so forth. I think I got one of those when I was a kid from the Boston Federal Reserve Bank. That's where I was a kid. Half of my childhood, anyhow, in Boston. So the Chicago Fed has their own, these individual Federal Reserve banks. They have different philosophies. They do different things. They have different interests. So the Chicago one does this, the National Activity Index. So what I was struck by here is a mnemonic. Ever see that film, Johnny Mnemonic? Anyhow, started in 1985, and they have, where did that go? 85 indicators. So 1985, 85 indicators. So there's 85 different things that they're looking at. I think of all three of these, it's definitely by far the most multifaceted. So this we all we all know what an index is. It's basically like a scaled measure. Okay, so it's basically for comparison. An index. The numbers are compared to one another. In themselves, they don't really mean anything. But in comparison to one another, you can, know good or bad. And I mean, actually, I shouldn't say they don't mean anything, right? They mean something, but the kind of thrust is their comparative value or their absolute value. So it's sort of designed to have a zero value if the economy is growing at its historical rate of growth, trend rate of growth. So this is that trend line we saw up here, right? If we're going up nicely along this trend line, then we have a zero in this index. And if it gets to negative 70, negative 7/10, then alarm bells go off, because that means that there is likely to be a recession. All of these 85 economic indicators taken together, in whatever way they take them together, are not doing well. They're indicating that we're about to hit a recession. So this is kind of interesting here. We have, -1. Oh, that's nice. It's going to tell us. It actually tells the amounts. Cool. So, negative 1.5, negative what? 2. Yeah, there we go. This one, see? Now this one's at that's below negative 7/10. Yeah. So actually, that was actually this recession started a little bit before it actually hit negative 0.7. But a lot of economics is approximations and estimations. We take broad strokes here. Again, this was sort of in the middle of the recession, so it didn't exactly predict it. And then in 2020, look at how short-lived that one was. COVID checks got us out of it pretty fast. Anyhow, yeah, so it's basically always correlated with recessions, which is kind of, I mean, look at that. See that there's a problem here. Look at this. It's like it's a negative 5.3, and then there's a recession. So I mean, it's only low in the recession. That's not very predictive. This one here is about the only one that had some predictive power. It's like, yeah, it hasn't hit zero point 0.7, and there was a recession. So is that really that great? It's kind of like, a tautology. It's like when there's a recession, all these things like production, income, employment, unemployment, powers, work, personal consumption, housing, sales, orders, inventories are all pretty much going to go down. Now, we did have that period I talked about in 2020 or 2022, when that was not the case, where we had, some falls and growth without unemployment. But yeah, I'm not super impressed with this. It ends up being, which was kind of my original instinct, it ends up being more like it's reporting recession. I wouldn't really call this as a predictor, as Chiang's saying it. It's more as it's happening. So it's kind of like after, during, and these next two are really predictors. So for testing purposes, I'm going to say that, we have one report, we have past, present, and two predictors for the future. If you tell me there's three predictors, I'll probably set it up so you won't have to make that choice. I won't count it wrong, but yeah, this is the real bottom line here. NBER, okay, their report, which does not seem to have an actual name. Just remember, NBER is past, all right, and we're going to say Chicago Fed is present. So know this. We have past. Where did that go? We have past, present, and then the really fun part, of course, future. And that is going to be the following two. And they are the LEI and the inverted yield curve. Okay. LEI, leading economic index. It's really weird. I've always heard this. I remember always hearing this as leading economic indicators. I don't know if this is a mistake. Somebody could Google it and let me know if it's leading economic indicators. I doubt he would make that mistake, so I guess it's leading economic index. Maybe the name changed. So in this one, what did he say? 12? Is that right? There are 10 indicators, not 12. 10 indicators that are used. Okay, so it went from 85 to 10. So, right, it's kind of a little bit like the other one, except this one's more designed to be a real predictor. It's probably the most famous predictor. You hear that a lot, LEI, or your leading economic index. Though I really count that as indicators, which sounds better to me somehow. But anyhow, LEI, leading economic index, fine. Uses 10 things, not 85, but it's really a predictor, where the other one is a describer. It's as it's happening. So predictor here, LEI. It has been so good that it's predicted 10 out of the last 7 recessions. Okay, that's a joke that I actually got from Chiang. He brings it up in here. And what that means is, as the reading is clear, is that while it has really, every time it's predicting a recession, it comes true, there are times that it predicts a recession that doesn't end up actually materializing. Okay, so leading economic indicator, a leading index, a leading predictor of recessions, leading economic index indicator. Okay, so yield curve. This is a really interesting one. The reason this one stands out, this is important to realize, and I really want you to know this. This is what's different about the yield curve. Everything else, it's looking at what the economy is doing. Okay, now it's not that the economy doesn't come down to people, but they are economic forces acting on the economy, and they're looking at those to make a past, present, or future report. The yield curve is like psychic. Okay, it's actually a survey of, in effect, it's a survey of what people think is going to happen. It's in their minds. Okay, that's what's so interesting about the yield curve. The yield curve is one. We had a whole bunch of economists coming together with the NBER. That wasn't a number per se, but economists using somewhat different methods when we had that NBER one. And then we have the Chicago Fed Activity Index, 85 different economic things going on, and then 10 different economic things going on for that, right? And remember, this one's the present, future. But this is one economic thing going on. But what there is a lot of is different investors. So it's actually picking up on investors' own intuitions or beliefs about what's going to happen in the future. This is a people one, even though its name doesn't indicate that. So, unfortunately, he does not have a nice stylized picture of a yield curve here. It basically goes from, and by the way, a bond yield is the interest that it's earning. So let's say, the yield curve goes like this. It's this kind of a shape. We have the bonds uh, yield, its interest rate. On the bottom, we have how long out the bond goes. So the real key to understanding this, well, the first key to unlock the first lock of understanding this is it's about the time period of the bond or bill, because short bonds are called bills. Forget the cutoff. But there's a you can buy. I mean, some of these use the overnight rates that banks use. I mean, when the Federal Reserve when the Federal Reserve loans to banks, they have this overnight rate. That's really short term. It's one night, but and then it can be at 3 months, and it goes up to 30 years actually. So the point of the yield curve is that normally, if investors are feeling good about the economy, then the interest rate goes up if we are moving further out into the future. Okay. Now, this is getting off into another topic, so don't stress this too much. But the reason that the interest rate is going to be lower in the future is it's like supply and demand. There's a lot of demand for debt. People want to buy bonds, which is they want to loan money. That is demand for debt if they want to loan money. If they think that they're going to get paid back, like businesses aren't going to start going out of business. So if things are good, if investors feel things are good, then there'll be more demand for shorter term treasuries, because in the shorter period, let's just say 3 years or 3 months, let's just say 3 months, if they're going well, then people want that. They don't want things for the far out future as much because they're less sure about the far out future. Who knows what's going to happen, right? The world could end. We just this morning it looked like we were, if it weren't for Trump's election, at least headed for a nuclear war. Global climate change. Who knows what's going to happen? But or for Trump's election at least. That's my feeling about it. But the point here is people want more bonds. There's more demand for it. The more demand there is for it, the lower the interest rates are, because it's like a price. It's like the more people are supplying money, which is the demand for bonds, I know this is getting confusing, then the lower the prices. And that's all I'm going to say about that, okay? So that is a yield curve. However, when it's inverted, what happens is people start demanding long-term bonds relative to short-term bonds at a greater rate. So then the interest rate for long-term bonds starts going down, and the short-term bonds start going up, which means that investors are not buying bonds in the short term because they're losing confidence in the near future. Okay, get this at least. I'm probably not going to expect you to know all the supply demand stuff, but just get it that the more people want a bond, the lower the interest rate will get. and even more importantly, that if there is a low interest rate long out in the long term, people have more confidence in the future, in the far future, than they do in the near future. And that's when interest rates are higher for short-term bonds. So if people have more, the theory is if people have more confidence in the far future than the near future, they think something bad's about to happen. So that if enough investors are thinking that, then the idea would be that that is predicting a recession. So that was the second kind of key. The first key is that it's about time. This whole yield curve, it's about how long these bonds are for. Or is it a 30-year debt? Is it a one-night debt? And we'll get to this in a minute, but and the kind of key time periods are 3 months versus 10 years. But right now, let's just look a little bit at this. Kind of interesting. See, now I like this a little bit better than the LEI, because the LEI, like I said, is I'm sorry, not the LEI. I like this a little bit better than the Chicago Fed. The Chicago Fed, keep passing that, activity index. Okay, because this is just reporting the now, and I like this predictive power. And if you kind of look here, you kind of see that. I'm getting ahead of myself because this is actually a technical measure of a very specific measure, inverted yield curve. But for right now, let's just say for the moment, I'll get to it in a minute, what this is actually, the treasury spread is. But look, inverted yield curve, it's like after there's a recession, not in the middle of it. Okay, so good predictor. Whereas the Chicago one, again, for the fifth time or something, is a in the moment thing. This is in the future. This is predicting the future. So know this treasury spread. Know what a treasury spread is. It's very simple. The long-term bonds. Remember, we want if the let me put it this way. If the long-term interest rates are higher, that's good news generally, because it means that the confidence in the future is greater than the confidence in the near future is greater than the confidence in the far future. So the yield, the interest rate paid on a 10-year bond minus a 3-year bill, because remember, short-term bonds are called bills, and I think it's a year. I'm going to say I think a bill is 1 year or less. If it's more than that, it's a bond. So so what do you think? This is the far out one, the 10-year bond, minus this is the 10-year bond, okay, minus the 3-month bill. If the economy is healthy, or investors think that it is, then the higher interest rate is going to be in the further future. The lower interest rate is going to be in the nearer future. So it's going to be positive, right? If it's negative, we have an inverted yield curve. And the treasury spread is the difference between these two. If it's negative, then obviously the 3-month bill is earning a higher interest rate than a 10-year bond. Means that there is more demand for bonds in the further out future. Less now, because people think something's up. And this therefore is negative. Okay, now a bit of something interesting about this inverted yield curve. We are in a moment in history, at least the last I checked 2 days ago, where we have had the longest period since this has been recorded of an inverted yield curve. We have been having an inverted yield curve for 2.5 years, 793 days as of 2 days ago. And but what's really weird, and this, by the way, this has happened after this book was published. I think he's working on his 7th. I know his micro text. I think I said there was a 7th edition of this. I don't think I'm right about that. I think that's the no. I was right about that. So yeah, but it's still, even in the 7th edition, I wasn't reading this. Anyhow, the point being, he didn't know about this, hadn't happened yet, but this is, recent, like 2 days ago, news. So we've had the longest yield curve ever, but there has not been a recession. So weird stuff. This new millennium, a lot of weird economic stuff. We're going to learn about a Phillips curve next chapter. I think we are. And that hasn't held true for the last 20 years either. So, yeah, strange times. Longest inverted yield curve ever. It basically started where there was supposedly a recession right around there, but there hasn't been one. Even though we've had the longest one ever. It's like people keep expecting it, but it's not happening. A little, I don't really consider this economics, but investment finance, as some of you may know, very, very high price to earning ratio, at least in this one more rigorous measure of the amount of the price that are being paid for stocks versus their return. And that's, that means that stocks are being overvalued. And guess what that means? There is a crash around the corner. Exactly when that corner hits, knowing that could make you a lot of money. But, okay, I won't give you investment advice. All right now, yeah. So, anyhow, yep, that's it for the business cycle. And I will reiterate once again, MBER, past description, describing, okay? Reporting and describing on the economy. We need to know if we're going to write up what the business cycle was, what it, when it was what. So, and then the present, while it's actually going on, these 85 indicators, which again is kind of a tautology, like a no-brainer, like, yeah, these 85 things are doing bad. The economy's probably bad as this one. Chicago National Fed one. Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm not sure what we really learned from this, because we're kind of already in a recession. So it's like kind of a tautology to say, oh, well, the indicators are that we're in a recession. Yeah, I think so. Stupid. Okay, these next two, LEI, that's a very big one as a predictor. It's done a good job. Sometimes false alarms. The yield curve historically has done a good job, but ironically, recently it has actually done what the LEI is more famous for doing. Said there was going to be a recession when there wasn't. Okay, we are done with that one. Okay, right. Oh, you guys should be doing this. Try to answer these questions, these checkpoint questions. The more practice you get in this stuff, the better. But do keep in mind that anything you learn in a lecture supersedes anything in the book or from another supplement. It's kind of like one of the reasons I'm telling you is because I don't want you to believe what the book is saying on that issue. Okay. Okay, I have backed up here to page 112. On page 112, I do want to comment on this here. Okay. This is only semantics. It's all my only critique here. Okay, this term he is using is a longer lecture, which I kind of hope to get to, which I don't think we're going to. But this term here, and this is something that I, hint, really want you to know. Okay, classical economists. We have, as far as macroeconomics at least, which is ironic because I'm about to say microeconomics is one of the schools of macroeconomics, we have three things going on, three major things going on. The first here, these three paragraphs, when he says classical economists, just cross that out. I know you can't hear, like add a note. Okay, neoclassical economists. We have three. I wonder if I could. We have three things going on here. You know what? Maybe see how this works. It didn't work so well until now because when I hit enter, it just closed it. How can I get to the next line? Darn. All right. Okay, so I was able to kind of do a whiteboard lecture thing here without a whiteboard. Um, so forget this use of the word classical. I'm not saying that it isn't used in this context, but it is a very, very poor use. I mean, there's at least several major terminologies in economics that are completely confusing. Take the word liberal, you know, liberals in Europe, as my Greek comparative economic systems teacher was commenting, means conservatives in this country. Neoliberal economic theory, and that is what you're going to be reading about if you do the extra credit in the book Reaganland by Steinstein. I get it mixed up. Fantastic 4 books he wrote, by the way. Neoliberalism, he talks about the development of, is just like a pro-business economic system. But when we talk about liberals, we usually mean Democrats, and to make it even more confusing, there's a lot of switcheroos with what's a liberal and what's a conservative. Before Trump, a conservative would be free trade almost exclusively because they're pro-business. Trump is into trade restriction, and the Democrats are the free trade party now. They're extremely, you know, they're what you used to call a conservative, you know, on expansionism. Being hawkish was more associated with the Republican Party. Now those are Democrats. Means warlike. And when I say hawkish, the Republicans are now more doves. Uh, Definitely the tax the rich thing that Trump wants to do, as opposed to the Democrats, is more traditionally the conservatives want to not tax the rich so much, whereas and have social programs, whereas the Democrats and liberals want to more tax the rich and more social programs. But again, liberal in Europe and is like someone that would not want to tax the rich. Okay, so I don't want to talk a lot about that, but terminology here this is just a really bad term to use, classical, uh, as versus Keynesian. In fact, what is really meant now, some schools have used this word wrongly recently. It's not entirely Chiang's fault. I've seen this at least in various forms, but it's really bad. So let's just kind of erase this and go here to the right. Classical. Now, this is something I do want you to know. Okay, so I've actually decided to go into a little bit more to actually just give this lecture at this point, or a very truncated version of it. But the students in the USDB, which is like the only military prison in the United States, at least for convicts, or I don't think they're called convicts in the military, but of 10 years or over in Leavenworth. It's in the film Card Counter. This USDB, United States Disciplinary Barracks. When I was teaching there, everyone really got this. I don't think anyone had, almost nobody, if anybody, had any problems understanding this once I'd explained it. So, back in the old days, the beginning of economics, in the for Europe at least, there was some stuff going on in India before that. That was definitely economics that I only recently has the West kind of become aware of that. But as far as Western economic history, there's some stuff in Greece, but Smith, it all starts with Smith. I mean, you could say that the mercantilists before him were economists of sorts, but he's the father of economics. Smith, Adam Smith. Everybody, if they don't know, should know Adam Smith. Wealth of Nations, 1776. Both sides try to kind of claim him. The best mousetrap at the lowest price is what a free market society will come up with. All about economic growth. He did not, however, he is not really credited with being macroeconomics is about economic growth. I think it's pretty well acknowledged, I should say, though, that Smith he's just talking about economic growth, period. That was it. Economic growth, beginning of economics, as it were, GDP, as we call it now, growth in a country. Probably called essentially that then too. They probably recognize that. So that was Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith famously believed in a labor theory of value, which kind of turned into a labor command theory of value. I did want to say about both people owning them. He also wrote a book about moral sentiments, which the people on the left and right are political terms, don't really apply to economics, but the reality is they often, you know, politics and economics are kind of bedfellows a lot. So I'll just say on the left, you know, they'll tell you about the theory of moral sentiments. It's also the case that when Smith did come up with this idea of a self-regulating market, economic growth comes from no government restriction, he kind of was doing a thought experiment. He did not think it would necessarily, in fact, I think he thought it probably would not lead to a particularly good society. Or that quote with Keynes, the wickedest of men with the wickedest of motives are good for the economy and all that. It's famous in Walls from the film Wall Street. Greed is good, which I don't really like because having inside information or trading is not people acting in their own self-interest to help the greater good. They're acting in their own self-interest to help their own self-interest. The point of Smith is that acting in your own self-interest, if everyone acts in their own self-interest, will increase the public good. The Chinese philosopher Yangtze, that was kind of like people shouldn't, they should only worry about themselves, and that's the best thing for the country. A pre-Taoist philosopher. Okay, so Smith, Ricardo, Marx. Now, Marx, as you probably know, labor theory of value, founder of communism. Also, all three of these, labor theory of value or some variation on it. But look at how different these are, Marx and Smith. So when they say classical economics is against Keynesianism, I mean, first of all, what's classical economics? Ideologically, there's Marx that wanted a communist revolution and the workers to rule the state, and there's Smith that said, or is generally characterized as saying, he wanted the state to be out of the economy, more or less, and that will behave the best under those circumstances. Ricardo is that whole comparative advantage that we all loved so much that we talked about. He kind of came up with that. That wasn't really the only thing, but these are the early guys, all right? 17, late 17, early 1800s, classical, labor theory of value, also strategic thinking. This is a microeconomic topic, but what that means is that firms are making a different product than their competitors, and they are charging their own prices, and they are trying to get the most profit, which often means the most business, and basically make everyone want their thing more than the other person's. So that's classical economics. Oh, and also economic growth. So you heard those three things. We got three things here for the classical economists. Gosh darn it. For the classical economists, we got labor theory of value. We have economic growth. Well, let me do that one last, actually, the economic growth one. It is one of the three, definitely. You don't have to know these in any order. Although I'm kind of, well, no, I won't say that. Maybe I'm kind of doing these in the order of importance, but you don't have to know that. Strategic. There's an E in there. Strategic thinking. I'm just going to put strategic. Businesses are strategic. Okay, they're coming up with strategies to make them different and more appealing and more desirable and less costly to produce than the other ladies and gentlemen in the market. So, and economic growth. Classical economics is all about how to. That was key to Smith right there. How do we bring about the most economic growth? And the takeaway and what most people took away from that is with, very little government regulation. So yeah, also labor theory of value. Value is, the amount of work that's put into it, basically. Marx had a different take on labor theory of value than did Smith, and the research I'm working on now to present in SF, and gosh, like not much more than about less than a month and a half, around a month and a half. I mean, not quite less. Labor theory of price. He really messed everything up, caused a confusion that to this day that I am going to debunk, but has plagued economics. Because there is no labor theory of value with Smith's take on it. It's a labor theory of price. That he has not discovered a labor theory of value in his explanation for it, but it's a labor theory of price. Ricardo kind of accepted it. Marx had a different take on the labor theory of value, but did have one to where he believed exploitation came from. Workers weren't getting paid for the amount of value, which is a function of their labor directly that they were putting into it. Okay, so that's classical economics. All right, oldest one. All right, I like so how many years ago was that? Like 250 years ago to maybe 200 years ago. Then we have these three very important figures in the history of economic thought: Jevons, Walras, Menger. Jevons was English. Walras was uh, Swiss, and I think he taught in France, same language, French. I was going to say French. And Menger was Austrian. And they all came up with something called the utility theory of value, which meant that and the law of diminishing marginal utility. This is where we actually get the demand curve. The more you have of something, the less valuable is an additional increment of that thing. Eventually. So you have one Coke, you're happy. The second Coke made you happier than the first. The third made you happier than the second. But the fourth does not make you happier than the third. The fifth, you're less happy with that than you were the fourth. And it goes on like that, essentially forever. Less and less and less. Did not believe in the labor theory of value. They said, value is subjective. And by the way, they're right. Okay. Value is subjective. And value has no meaning. An object's value only has meaning in terms of how a subject interacts with it. It can only have value to a subject. If it didn't have value to a subject, it wouldn't have value. That's why the utility theory of value is correct, and this labor theory of value nonsense is that. Although we do get a labor theory of price in the neoclassical long run, which is a micro topic, which I will say no more about. Marshall, there's a little write-up on him somewhere in the book. It's interesting. You should read it. He came up with supply and demand in particular. He kind of was in a sense, he was bringing these two together, the classical and the neoclassical, to get price, not value. Okay, so neoclassical, another thing about them. So what did I tell you? Value, different. Did not have a labor theory of value. Had a utility theory of value. Utility theory of value. Got that? Okay. I should probably write that here. And okay, a little side excursion here. I want you to notice this. We go to margins. We hit margins here we're in the layout. Okay, let me back up. Well, you're in home, say. You go to layout, you get layout. You go to margins, you get margins. You go to narrow. Okay, this is what I want on your macroeconomics in the news assignments. Any writing assignment. Narrow margins. Okay. Not seeing a lot of that. I may take some points off for that eventually. Maybe even the next time. So let's get that right. So, we're talking now about the differences between between the classical and neoclassical schools of economics. So let's just fill out this chart real quick. The three at the top, we have We have here classical school. We have here the neoclassical school, which is, I get to this in a minute. It's the same that also called. Is I don't, it's just not like a perfect identity, but it's close enough. Also called microeconomics. And or here we have post Keynesian. Now remember, John was talking about Keynesian. That term is not as problematic to call them Keynesian. It's this classical one that's all messed up, which we'll get back to. Forget about that. Right now, at least, although you can't actually pretty much forget about it forever. So, we have here, like, I don't know the exact dates, like latest 1700s to early-ish 1800s. And we have this, which is like early 1800s to the present. And I guess I might as well just do this here. Okay, so labor theory of value, difference, strategic thinking, basically okay, so big change. Utility theory of value is the biggest revolution. It's often called the marginalist revolution because it's talking about the marginal utility, the next additional increment, its eventual drop in value compared to the value of the increment before it. Strategic thinking, that's branding, advertising, individualization, pricing, product development. It's all strategic thinking. And in micro, it's just entirely algorithmic. It's assumed in their kind of central model, perfect competition, that all firms are exactly alike. None of them can influence a market price. They have to take a price. Okay, they're all making exactly the same thing. Okay? It's like entirely different. Economic growth. Yeah, Smith was all about the economic growth. Marx discussed it extensively. I believe Ricardo had some things to say about it here. And neoclassical economics, as much as they may try to deny this, is not at all about economic growth. It's about circularity. It's about optimizing what we have, not making more of it. How do we make the most of what we have? I'm going to actually change that a little bit to optimization. Putting either on a test will get you a right answer. Optimizing the resources you already have. This is about growing those resources. And it's always in here. This is not equilibrium. This is, I guess, the real big word here too is equilibrium. Okay. So, in fact, I think I'm just going to keep this here, equilibrium. Yeah, and if you say any of the three I use here, that's fine. I like this. Equilibrium, growth, equilibrium. And you notice, and by the way, the first four chapters that we studied of Chiang were microeconomics almost entirely. I think he said some things about growth in there, but largely, almost entirely microeconomics, same thing as neoclassical. Now, this term neoclassical is not a very good term because when you hear the word neo, like in music, neoclassical, we had classical music in the West that predominated until the 1920s, and we switched to being much more uh, African diaspora music, and that lasted. And in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, it started in the 70s, got really popular in the 80s in rock music. There was a movement called neoclassical, and they were going back to playing, basically the the classical style of music on, incorporated into rock, where instead before it had been African diaspora in terms of the lead playing where that change occurred, and British folk music, which is also the music that is performed by Appalachians, a population which our soon-to-be vice president is a member of. So, terrible term because it should be a return to classical, but it has nothing to do with classical, and I think that may play into the confusion that Chiang is getting into in his use of this word. Um, so, classical, totally different than neoclassical. So then what is Keynesian? Well, this term here, was not one that we had from the early 1800s to the 1930s. More than 100 years went by. There was no term like microeconomics. It's like once I read these Atlantic Little Brown, indeed, Encyclopedia Brown children's stories, and I remember he solves one mystery about the authenticity of a Civil War sword because it said Bull Run 1 on it. That was one of the reasons he realized it was not authentic. At the time of Bull Run, there was no Bull Run 1. There was just Bull Run. It wasn't until there was a Bull Run 2, there was a Bull Run 1. The World War One was not called the Great War for about 20 years or more. It was called the Great War. It only became World War One when it was World War Two. So obviously there wasn't a microeconomics until there was a macroeconomics. And this is, by the way, all macroeconomics, although it gets a little confusing because, as we know, Chiang is kind of saying there's two kinds of macroeconomics. There's classical and Keynesian, but it's really neoclassical and macroeconomics, to put it briefly. What happened, well, okay, so I guess I'll just say this. What happened was that once Keynes had introduced the need for government in the economy, okay, so these folks here, they didn't want government in an economy. Now, I'll say for Smith, okay, yeah, that's probably why they're ultimately calling it classical, because this is an anti-government primarily stance. Excuse me, this is a primarily anti-government stance. Ricardo had, some of that. Marx not, though. That's one of the problems with calling, basically identifying classical essentially entirely with being anti-government. Classical is anti-government. Okay, they did have that in common, but they were for entirely different reasons. Whereas Keynes came along, Mr. Keynes came along, and it's like, no, we're going to need government because we weren't hitting equilibrium in the labor market and having unemployment for like a really long time. And as we know in microeconomics, it's supposed to resolve an equilibrium. Well, it didn't, and that's why we have macroeconomics. However, starting in the 1970s, when there started being major, basically inflation and unemployment, which you're not supposed to have, because in Keynesian's time, when there was unemployment, there wasn't inflation and other issues. There started to be a real strong pushback against Keynesianism. And then in the 1990s, when the United States kind of won the Cold War, the West did, is like this big shot in the arm for market economics, even a bigger hit to Keynes. And then now, when you read the textbook, it's like he talks about classical versus Keynesianism. Well, what he's talking really means is neoclassical versus Keynesian, because microeconomics has entered into macroeconomics in the 70s, 90s, and more recently, more and more, it's taken it over. However, as hopefully you learned from the intro quiz, if there's a slowdown, government gets involved. That's even in the textbook. So, contrary to some claims made out there, Keynes has not been defeated by microeconomics, fundamentally. I admit there was problems in the 1970s having to do with supply and stuff, but so government, not government here. Okay, the very different. It's not classical versus Keynesianism. It's neoclassical or microeconomics versus Keynesian. Now, there's Keynesian economics, there's Keynesian synthesis, which is, this Samuelson book, which had been around from, it was like the only textbook in undergraduate economics from the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War. He was synthesizing Keynesianism with neoclassical. Okay, and there's still elements out in this one. Post-Keynesians are kind of way out there, folks. Heterodox economists as opposed to more orthodox. There's a lot of subtle differences here, but these two are opposed. These two are opposed. Okay, these two. So the question would be, well, what about Keynesian versus classical? They are not very opposed. Okay, a lot of, at least post-Keynesians, there's a lot of different kinds of Keynesians. They can kind of run the spectrum from more over here to more over here. I mean, this is Marx. A lot of post-Keynesians are Marxists, are very sympathetic with Marx. That's classical. Okay, they generally, believe in strategic thinking, and they are very concerned with economic growth. I should say about neoclassical and economic growth. They'll tell you about the Swan Solo model, for instance, or the Ramsey model. They're basically about savings. Okay, it is about economic growth, but they're really only interested in how much is being saved, and they essentially and tech. They have something with technology in there. It's basically about how the more we save, the more we build capital, the more economic growth we have. So that's their kind of 2 cents worth about economic growth, is just adding time to their equilibrium model. Although actually Swan Solo really doesn't add time, that's more Ramsey. But so I mean, they do have a growth theory, but centrally it is not about growth. However, classical economics is all about the growth. Keynesian economics is essentially all about the growth. That was from the first paper we read in the class. For those of you who read it, that was about micro versus macro and how this is about growth, and how this is not about growth, which is why it's better for the environment, because it's bad for the environment. And I will tell you very briefly that the way, again, very important, very central research interest of my own in my dissertation, the way that they value climate damage is using macroeconomics. They're supposed to be the mainstream that are concerned with this, but all of a sudden they're doing this because guess what? They don't have to have any restraints that way. And that is what I mostly wanted to get out of that daily article at the very beginning, that microeconomics has these constraints. Although he does go on to talk, Daly does, about something else that I at least on the surface, I don't like, because he's talking about the second law of thermodynamics, which A, is not applicable to economic systems, and B, is basically on its way out the door in physics. In your lifetime, they're not going to have the second law of thermodynamics anymore. Yeah, economic growth, equilibrium. So it's these two. So I want you to know is these two are the opposed schools. Neoclassical, and you can say Keynesian. Just Keynesian and neoclassical. Bam. Keynesians have actually a lot more in common with classical than they do neoclassical. So to try to say, as Chiang does, that these two, that classical and Keynesian, are opposed, dead wrong. Okay, now look at how this kind of works out coolly. We have, in a cool way, coolly doesn't quite work, right? Classical versus neoclassical, which neoclassical would imply that it's, has a similarity, but it's in this context, it should be understood as entirely different, fundamentally. And then we have microeconomics versus, let's try that again. We have microeconomics versus macroeconomics. So you see how of these three, the kind of nexus is neoclassical and microeconomics, with neoclassical being opposed to classical and micro being opposed to macro. Okay. As I said, though, macro in the book we're reading now has absorbed a lot of micro, but the distinction that Chiang is making within macroeconomics is micro versus Keynesian. John Henry, my first professor and informal undergraduate advisor, he's just like one of the first things he said to me, first conversations, he was saying, well, macroeconomics has just been like taken over by microeconomics, and that was like 20 years ago. It's become even more embedded since then. Yeah. So we don't like this term classical economists here. It's Keynesian versus neoclassical. Neoclassical economics. Go back to our first statement here. And by the way, this is a way of spelling I had kind of come up with on my own, especially to have two words together, like the second one capitalized. It's become very popular recently, but especially in Chinese in Chinese pinyin, I would do that because each syllable is its own character, and it's kind of like separate syllables like this. So it'd be like ni hao, like that, instead of like this. I'm not saying I invented it, but I hadn't seen anyone do it before. Now it's all over the place to do it like, well, it's usually bringing two words together, like YouTube or something. But yeah, then these normally here would be this. So that's the correct spelling. I don't feel I need to bring a revolution in spelling on this point. So yeah, okay. I went back to page 112. I want you to know that lecture, okay? And I want you to know this is a very bad way of describing it. As I said, I don't believe it's unique to Chiang, but very misleading. Now we come to the juice. Smoothie. We used to have this Jamba Juice in Sacramento starting around the turn of the millennium. I've not found it out here. They do have smooth fruit smoothie places, but not Jamba Juice. So I haven't found one anyhow. I was just talking about John Henry. My first teacher was a macro class. He did this exactly. Now this, mind blown for me. This really blew my mind. It's like, wow, so simple, but I never got that. So when I'm explaining what it's not, you may not have been confused by what it's not, but that had always confused me. Bottom line, suppose you spend $5 on a smoothie. And John Henry used a glass of milk to make this point, but that $5 is not going to juice. The juice is not getting the $5. The $5 is entirely going to other people. Okay? Now, I am going to I don't like this because it's just, it really should be simplified into 4 categories. Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, this whole profits, okay, for me, profits and income are the same thing for a business. I went to AI and it insisted they were different and then gave a definition of each that was like they were the same thing. So, for the purposes of this class, these are exactly the same thing. Okay? That is number one. So let's say, and I'm changing this. I'm changing what Jiang says. I don't have a big problem with it. I'm just simplifying it. I guess I have a problem with it because I think we can just make it simpler here. But, oh, man. All right. I'll just not close the parentheses to save space. I think you get the idea. Or make a triangle bracket. Oh, come on. Okay, so $1 of I'm going to change this smoothie, by the way. It's not going to be a smoothie. It's going to be a fruit juice. And this fruit juice you are buying from a roadside orchard stand. Um, okay, so think of it as fruit juice. We're to the right. And we have, for starters, profit. Let's say, so you spend $5 on the juice. $1 goes, and this juice is at a roadside stand. It's being sold by the farmers. So you pay them $5 for the fruit juice. And they have a juicer there. And of that $5, the farmer gets $1 in profit. $2 this farmer had to pay to the farm workers. He's renting the land from somebody. And this can also be thought of as, when they say rent in economics, rent on capital, they mean payments for capital. So for the equipment and so forth, the land, all of his capital, that isn't his human capital, skills and capabilities and so forth, is rent. Now, when they talk about this formally, they're going to use rent a lot in the using the meaning that you're going to be a lot more familiar with. But in economics, yeah, land capital. He has to pay $1 for that, and then of course there's old Uncle Sam wants his cut. There's $1. So do you see now? And like I said, for some reason this blew my mind. That $5 you're paying to the farmer goes to profit. It goes to wages. Goes to rent. Goes to rent. It goes to taxes. That's the end of the $5. It went to people involved in the production of the fruit juice, or people getting money from it who weren't involved, like the government, though they probably built the road that you drove along to get there. So I would say that they're probably involved in much production, at least. Okay, so this is fruit juice. This is all income. Okay, so when we get to that so loaded word, I think I'm about to make a mess here. GDP. This is one way of accounting GDP. Okay, imagine every consumer and every producer in the world, and it comes down to this. Let's make it a smoothie shop. The profit, it's going to the smoothie shop. Okay, $1 of that is their profit. Okay, $2 is in wages for everybody else. Okay, oh man, and then $1 is in rent for their equipment, and they're paying for, and then they pay $1 in taxes. So it's not really different. It could be any good or service. It gets divided up into these categories. Profit or business income, but I'm going to call it profit. Profit, wages, rent, tax. Bam, that's it. That's all I want you to know about. This is GDP. All of these added up, all of the income, profit, wages, rent, and taxes and or fees in the economy are GDP. That's it. It's GDP. It's one way of looking. There's two ways to look at GDP. This is the income way of looking at GDP. And like I said, for my tests, I just want you to know these four categories. That's all you got to know. You're free to learn the technical definition, but this is it. That's it. That's half. That's the first. That's it for the first half of GDP right there. We've already got that. Okay. This is all. So all the profits in the entire economy, all the wages, all the rent, all the taxes or fees, all that goes to government. That's GDP in this country. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, and Chung does talk about this, which is good, GNP. Now, this is interesting to me personally. Now, GDP is gross domestic product. It's everything that's produced for the United. If it's the United States' GDP, then it's everything that's produced within the borders of the United States. So if I own a wool interest in New Zealand and I make a lot of money off of that wool, then that does not count as GDP. Other than it does not count as GDP. Okay, even if it's my name, that's the difference between GDP and GNP. Now it's interesting because when I grew up, when I was even some of your ages, it was called GNP. We just, the way you guys hear GDP today is always GNP, 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 GNP. But with globalization, okay, when ownership got so crazy in different corporations, I mean, corporations are like their own country practically. It doesn't matter too much where they're based in a lot of cases. You know, who the nationality of the income earner was just doesn't matter very much. What really matters is where it's being produced, where this economic activity is happening within whose borders. So that's gross domestic product, and that is a difference. Something to pay that I want you to know. Okay, this difference. So GDP, we have done the spending. Excuse me, we have done the income portion of GDP, which is a little. See, this is something I don't like about the way Chiang does this. He goes from talking about the smoothie, and then he starts talking about another form of GDP, but he doesn't make clear this is the raw simplified version of of income. Income side of GDP. So it would make a lot of sense to go right from here to talking about income, the income approach. So that's what we're doing. We skipped right to income. So just kind of take note. These are not the four categories that I said. I get that. Okay, compensation employees, that's wages. Proprietors, income. Okay, this is something we didn't talk about. There's two kinds of businesses in this world. There's the people owned, how should I put that? The private owned one, that's proprietor's income, just private owned. It can be one person, a sole proprietorship. It can be more than one person, a partnership. That was messy. But that's proprietor's income. Okay, corporate profit, corporation, limited liability. If it's a proprietor that's owning a business, a single person proprietorship, they can go after your home, your car, your jewelry, whatever. If it's corporate, the owners are stock owners basically, and if there's business liabilities, then they can't go after the owners. You're only liable for the portion of the company that you own. So okay, here it is again. Okay, wages right here, compensation to employees. These two both these two both are putting together corporate profit and proprietor's income. These are both profits. Okay, income, profits. As I said, you may learn differently. For me, same thing. Profit, business income. So one, compensation of employees' wages. These proprietor's income, corporate profit are. Oh yeah, maybe I can do a cool thing here and see if I can pull this off. Are wages. Profits. And we are going to introduce the symbol. Oh, or maybe we will not introduce the symbol. Well, yeah, we will. We are going to introduce a symbol for profits that is pretty universal in economics. Pi notes can also mean inflation. Gets confusing. In this class, this means profit. Profits. If it's inflation, then it's going to be is going to be this pi. Now, I have not seen this used before, but this is inflation. Okay, so we got that. Inflation, this is profits. So let us continue. Okay, and this, by the way, for reasons I'd really rather not go into, is also going to be profit. So we got that profit, 3 categories of profit, except that was supposed to be blue. There we go. Profit. So profit, wages is red, profits are blue, rental income is green, and I'm teaching you. Okay, so this I'm just going to say is rent, even though it doesn't mean rent on capital, which, by the way, is actually this profit, because if money's going to capital for rent, it's going to the companies that make that capital. Okay, so this is going to be more like land, per se, more in the way you're probably used to it being. Let's see, rent. And the last one, last but not least, taxes. I haven't had too much problem with the IRS. Like, they're really cool. If I make a mistake, they'll just kind of correct it for me, and then if I owe them a little more, they'll let me know. If they owe me, they'll let me know. We fill out a form. But state taxes, the MDR, I went through like 3 years. I won a court case against Panera. Someone found a Google review I wrote that was negative about Panera. I think it had to do with their rudeness, and a lawyer who was representing a group that was suing them picked me to be the class representative. Earned $1,500. The problem is that it was reported to the MDR that I'd earned $150,000. That was the amount of the entire suit. It had to do with them putting Roundup on grain that was being stored, or using grain that was treated that way when they're supposed to be organic and fresh and so forth. So it was like 3 years, 2 or 3 years that I went round and round. I mean, I have never had that much problem with bureaucracy, but I had to watch ultimately Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to kind of defeat them, because spoiler, but yeah, that movie kind of results in has to do with defeating bureaucracy. So yeah, taxes are yellow. And it is not rent, by the way. It is government. I'll just say tax. Okay, so are we all good here? I divided it into 4 categories. This actually kind of worked out. Wages, that's 1. Another is profits. Profits are 2. Rent is 3 here. Okay. And basically to landlords. That's what we're talking about. Rental money going to landlords. Oh, who does this go to, by the way? Maybe I should make that wages go to workers. Profits go to businesses. Now, the workers and the businesses and the landowners, they all may be making capital that somebody else buys. Okay. But it's about, in this measure, it's about the income that is being earned. Okay. It's not about spending. That's going to be the other one, which you're going to be talking about in a moment. But yeah, the income is in terms of wages. This can be finished good producers. It can be input good producers. It doesn't matter, because we're talking about the form of income. So we have wages, profits, rent, and tax. Let's go through that one more time. Wages, profits, or profit, rent, and tax. Okay, good. Summing up income. Okay, so now we're actually done. talking about income here. Expenditures is very important to Keynesian economics. Unfortunately, we're not going to really. Oh, in government fiscal policy, in that last chapter, we did cover Keynesian economics, and I think he had some things to say about the monetary stuff at the end. But the kind of root theoretical approach of Keynesian economics, which is pretty central to macro class, we're not covering. But I think the aggregate demand, aggregate supply stuff, government fiscal policy is sufficient. You'll know from that all you really need to know for this class. Um, you'll learn, you know, a lot more about the specifics of Keynesian theory if you take an upper division macro class, I think. Okay, and by the way, GDP is I think I mentioned earlier, is the sort of central measure of NIPA, which is a methodology. Okay, so just to be clear, NIPA, National Income and Product Accounting, is a methodology. I think I'm getting this right. And GDP is a measure. Okay, NIPA isn't measuring anything. It's like a methodology. It's kind of the general measuring of everything. And GDP is actually measuring something, which is all of the income earned in the United States in the four categories I said, the way I'm dividing it. It's a little different than how it's officially divided, just to make it more theoretical and formally Platonic. So, this is the second way that you can evaluate GDP. Now, this is another kind of aha moment. This is really cool, right? Everything that's spent is earned, and everything that is earned has been spent. Therefore, all income, all income earned in the economy, and all expenditures made in the economy are equal to each other if we put aside the issue of export and imports, which we'll get to. I'm not probably going to ask you anything about imports or exports on the test other than to know that exports minus imports are an expenditure. But I'm going to explain a little bit about it. But let's put that aside. Let's forget what do they call that? The import sector or something. Anyhow, so we're going to talk about the domestic specter, the sphere, and so expenditures. So super simple here. We saw this. I don't know if I actually did see this in chapter 10 because I think I had to skip over it because we didn't really study it. And I don't like that color there. Come on. There we go. Oh. How do I get rid of this now? Okay, so this is what I'm trying to highlight. The expenditures or expending approach. So this is like super no-brainer, at least at this level. It's just going to be this C plus I plus G. So C plus I plus G. Uh, yeah, C plus I plus G right here, right? So what this is consumption, expenditures, finished goods, things you're going to consume, three categories. Okay, I don't really care about that too much. I'm not saying it wouldn't be on a quiz or a test because it is in the reading, but I'm not going to lecture on it. So investment. So what you have here is basically, I would just think of this as goods and machines. All right, goods are consumption. Investment is in the things that make consumption, machines and so forth. Um, and you know, pretty much raw materials. Here it says software. You get the idea. These are all in non-human inputs to production. Okay, so when firms buy machines, they are engaging in investment spending. When consumers buy finished goods, they are engaging in consumption spending. So there really are only two categories here: finished goods and inputs. The other two, one of which is government purchases. Okay, you know, government government buys stuff too. Uh, does not include transfer payments, so let's get that. Government, paying out checks to individuals goes into consumption spending. This is when government buys stuff, like the Pentagon buys tanks. Okay, that's government purchases. Uh, if government buys cars for its employees to drive, government purchases. So that's government buying stuff. So super easy. A little note here about investment. It's a little bit interesting. So GDPI, which is GDP investment, if that goes down, then we're headed for a recession. So there's another little recession indicator here, which is also, not really a predictor. It's just an effect. It's not a cause of a recession. It's an effect of a recession. When there's a recession, businesses don't think they're going to earn money, so they close shop or they cut production. They don't buy as much stuff. They don't buy machines to invest. Things are going well. They buy machines to invest, and guess what? If they need machines, they need workers. So super easy stuff here. I'm not going to talk too much more about it. Just C plus G plus I, except we do need to now go ahead and add our net exports here. So we have X for exports and M for imports. Now, this is an important accounting thing methodology. Let's just now assert this. Okay, this I think it should say it's equal to, not identifies with, because they're not the same thing, but it's equal to, guess what? Wages plus, oops, where can I get that? There we go. All right, because he talks about that here. Okay, so we had wages plus profit plus rent plus salary income. Okay, so we are bringing it all together. You see this, except I haven't talked about this yet. I get that. Putting that aside for the moment, we have this. Well, this equals this. And they have both equal GDP. This is GDP. Everything that is spent, okay, everything that is spent is equal to all income. The spenders are giving it to the earners, and the earners are giving them back stuff. This is GDP. As GDP grows, there is more spending and there is more income. Now, John Maynard Keynes is very concerned with this side of things. That's why in Chapter 10 with government fiscal policy, that was this. We talked about government spending. Okay, and if we're at excess capacity, if we increase government spending, say this increases. You all know about alt keys, right? You can do alt and hit some numbers and make symbols. So if government spending goes up at excess capacity, then GDP goes up. So maybe we can get on the same side in both. There we go. There we go. Yeah. Okay. That's government fiscal policy. So now a little bit of a rabbit hole, maybe with this. Like I said, know this, memorize this, or know it. Okay, know this, know this. It's 4 and it's 4. These, government spending, this is taxes, pretty much the same thing. Now, other than that, although governments can engage in deficits, so that makes it a little more complicated. But other than that, this isn't really a 1-to-1 ratio. Be clear on that. It's like consumption. If you buy the juice, it's going to wages, profits, rent, and taxes, all 4. Investment. It's a firm is buying. My dad used to be a an engineering manager, and he made a company that he'd work for these companies that would make blades in one case, and another it was like nozzles, beat fog nozzle, and goodness, where was that? Massachusetts. I think that was is that the one in Greenfield? Anyhow, the point being here, what I'm trying to say is, though, investment. Okay, is investment spending, but that spending goes to a company that makes, like Beat Fog Nozzle, they're paying wages, they're earning a profit, they're renting, probably, they're paying taxes. So, each one of these kind of can go into all of these, and as a corollary, I think you can reasonably, or at least say, one of these things, like say wages, uh, you know, can of course come from all of these categories. One of these can come from any or all of these categories. So it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but the aggregate of all spending and the aggregate of all investment, income. Let's try that again. The aggregate of all spending and the aggregate of all income are equal to each other. Okay, now this little number here, it's actually pretty straightforward. Okay, export dollars. Okay, so export dollars are money spent, and it's usually we're not going to get to that. I'd hope to do that, the sexy kind of foreign currency exchange stuff in the last chapter, but very briefly, like if a foreign company wants to buy something in the United States, generally they have to take their Singapore dollars and exchange them for US dollars in order to buy the stuff from the United States. So those dollars coming in from Singapore, spending. This is spending. It's not domestic spending, but it goes into income. So this X here has to, in addition to these other things, the X has to go into income, but it's not coming from the U.S. So this is GDP because the exports are being manufactured in the United States. All of the spending is going into income in the United States, so it's GDP. And then this here, okay, is going to be import dollars. And because this is GDP, then all of the spending that's going outside of the United States to other countries to usually, generally buy their currency and get their stuff is not income earned in the United States. Okay? It is spending that's going elsewhere. So this is not a part of GDP, and we have to subtract it from spending because it is not going to equal, in addition to the other stuff, GDP. It's going elsewhere, overseas. That's why it's often called a leakage. And we're almost done here. The last really big point I want to make about GDP is this thing that Chiang says. He says, well, people worry that, if imports go up, that means GDP is going to go down. So he said, "Oh, but don't worry about that. It doesn't affect GDP." Well, that's right and wrong. I would not say it's an entirely wrong answer. It depends on. I mean, I would not say that that's an entirely correct answer. Did that get a little messed up there? Let me kind of let me back up here. I'm not sure what all got recorded. So we have this X minus M and exports, spending from abroad. Okay, that are income to the United States. It's income being earned domestically in the United States. So this goes to this, goes to GDP. And then this is spending that's going abroad. It's not being spent in the United States. So it has to be subtracted. Import spending has to be subtracted from spending in order for spending to equal income, because this is spending that is not going into income, it's going abroad. So that is where we get this X minus M. Now, something of note is that Chiang, let me see if I can find that. Okay, this is a bad statement. Oh, man. This is a bad statement. It's a very poor statement. That is not necessarily the case. It may be the case, may not be the case, but it may be the case. It depends. If, let's go back to our equation here. Find it. Yeah, here we go. Good. If imports increase, okay, and I mean, really, Chang's just plain wrong in that statement. If other things were equal, then increasing imports do lead to a smaller GDP. I believe he's just trying to make some, avoid some anti-trade argument here, and getting into the microeconomic roots where they think free trade is great or something. So, I mean, look at this. If M increases, then domestic income is going to decrease. Okay, and that means that GDP is going to decrease. If consumers decide, or investors, or government decides, it would be unlikely government, what it might, but in another economy it could. Uh, you know, if these expenditures, if these three expenditures start going abroad, then increasing imports, then earnings are down in the United States. GDP has gone down, basically. I mean, it has. You know, this says if M's gone up, GDP's gone down. Kind of period, end of story. The only sense in which would not be true is more of the special case. If expenditures went up domestically in the United States, causing earnings to go up domestically in the United States, then uh, you wouldn't see a fall in GDP. And more specifically, is if spending domestically went up, causing earnings domestically to go up. Excuse me. If spending went up in the United States to offset any increase in imports, then income would remain stable and GDP wouldn't be changed. But that's like a special case. It'd have to be it'd have to be offsetting domestic spending. So this is just one of these many examples of ideology causing Chiang to make a false statement, basically, because he doesn't want people to say, "Hey, wait a minute, you know, increasing imports reduces GDP, so we shouldn't have free trade because if it's going to increase imports. It only makes sense if we're also increasing exports." Because we could also have, if imports obviously went up and exports went up, then that wouldn't, in equal proportion, then that wouldn't affect GDP either. So anyway, I just wanted to be aware that statement Xiang makes about imports don't reduce GDP, untrue. That would be a special case, and since the general case is that increasing imports will lead to a smaller GDP than other things equal, then that is essentially a false. This is essentially a false statement.